Thank you. You know, this is, for those of you who don't know, this was kind of my home. I left, just let me tell you a little bit, and this is not on my script, sorry, so I'll make it short, but I came to Columbia to go to school in 1992, so I'm 45, in case that anybody was calculating, and I had been very involved as a flute player at St. Pius in Moberly, and I was so burned out because they would never let me sing that when I came down here, I told my sister who was involved at the Newman Center, don't you dare tell anybody that you have a sister who is majoring in music. And so for 3 years, I didn't do anything with music, with church music down here. And then I had an atheist fiance and broke up. And in the fallout of that, I realized I was being called to come back here. And almost as soon as I started in the music ministry at the Newman Center, I met my husband in the choir. So this place is very special to us. So tonight we're going to talk about what other story, Bible story, might we talk about if we're talking about neighbor. We're going to talk about the Good Samaritan, of course. So there's a guy who takes a trip from Jerusalem to Jericho, right? And along the way he gets mugged. Violently mugged, like in today's terms, we'd say he's shot and left for dead, kind of mugged. And holy man number one comes along, sees him and goes, "Oh, not my problem." And he passes on the other side of the road and leaves the poor guy for dead. Holy man number two comes along and says, "No, I can't get involved," and also leaves him for dead. Then along comes the pariah of religious society. In modern terms, we might say he's an atheist, or a socialist, or even a member of ISIS. And this man sets aside all of his commitments, whatever they are, and he picks up this total stranger, takes him to the next hotel, and pays for a doctor to come and take care of him. And he leaves his credit card number to make sure any further expenses are covered. The point being, which one of these guys would you say acted like a neighbor? This is a familiar story, and as so many of Jesus' stories did, it came from a conflict. In this case, it was a scholar of the law, but people were always quarreling with Jesus in the Gospels. Have you noticed that? It seems like it's always happening. This guy, this scholar of the law, comes to Jesus and says, "I want to make sure you actually know what you are talking about. So I'm just going to ask you, what does it take for me to get to heaven?" Now, Jesus, being Jesus, doesn't take the bait. He's a model for all mothers and fathers down through the ages. He's like, "I'm not doing your homework for you. You tell me the answer." And so the guy does, and of course he knows the answer. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Great. Jesus says, okay, moving on. But this guy is not ready to move on. He is like, right, but who is my neighbor? Now, here's the thing to remember, that the whole of the Jewish law was really intended to lay out what it means to love your neighbor. All of those regulations were set about in order to try to create a just society. So you have to wonder what's the reason for a scholar of the law to come asking a question like this in the first place. The Bible tells us he wants to justify himself, like, how little can I do and still pass inspection? Which also sounds like my children. Only my kids, none of yours, right? So when Jesus finished telling that story, I have to think that that scholar of the law had wished he had never opened his mouth. Because Jesus didn't really answer the question that he asked. The scholar was asking, who can I exclude? Like, I know what it means to love somebody, and it's a big deal. So who do I actually have to do this for? Does it have to be for my family, my literal neighbors? Is it the people in my synagogue? Is it everybody in my town? Is it everyone who is of the Jewish faith? And the lesson of this parable is that there is no outer circle. Neighbor is not a group of people at all. Neighbor is a state of mind. The answer is everyone is my neighbor, but only if I choose to make it so. Now, this parable doesn't really explain why a priest and a Levite might pass by and leave a guy bleeding on the side of the road for dead. But they didn't really have to, because the people at that time would have understood the context Just like when two Catholics go to daily mass and somebody says, "Lord, I am not worthy to that you should enter under my roof," then everybody goes, "Yes, I've done that too." There's like a whole back story to that. There's a whole context that we all understand, and that's the way this parable was for the Jewish people. They knew the cultural context. Maybe you have heard this before, but a priest on his way to Jerusalem could very well have been on his way to perform priestly duties in the temple. And in order to do that, he had to be ritually clean. And if you touch a dead body, you are ritually impure. So if he goes out of his way to help this man who's bleeding on the side of the road, and this man dies while he's helping him, then he is ritually impure and cannot perform his duties in the temple. And it's a 7-day ritual in order to be cleansed. So, we all know what happens in these days of priest shortages when somebody gets hurt, somebody gets sick, and suddenly there's a big scramble. So we know what that's like. So this priest is thinking, anybody can help the guy bleeding on the side of the road, but not everybody can offer sacrifice in the temple. So I'm going to leave that to someone else because there are plenty of people who can do that job. It actually kind of makes sense if you're thinking in worldly terms. Parables are really great because in a lot of ways, they transcend time and space, but not in all ways, because they have particular power when they're pointed at a specific audience in a specific time and a specific place. So Jesus' parables, we can really understand the message, but it doesn't quite skewer us the way that it would have skewered the community that was listening to it, unless we intentionally work to figure out how that translates into our own time and place. That word intentional is important to me, as Kelly said. Earlier this year, I founded an online ministry called Intentional Catholic. And I did that because it's been growing in my heart for a long time. Over the past couple of decades, participating in the Catholic blogosphere, being a natural family planning teacher, chatting online with pastoral musicians around the United States, I've come to the conclusion that we all have the right intentions. Our hearts are all in the right place. We bicker a lot. We have a lot of disagreements, but everybody's hearts are in the right place. But what we're often missing is a connection point between the concepts of our faith and what they look like when we apply them to real life in the daily grind in concrete and practical ways. So what I'd like to do is take a look at this parable and see how it looked to the Jews and how that might translate into modern terms. So there's several things that I can imagine that the people listening to this parable might have thought. First of all, it's his own fault. Everybody knows that road from Jericho. I'm going to hazard a guess that people are thinking, what was he thinking going down that road by himself? He knows better. Everybody knows that road is crawling with thieves and murderers. He got himself into his own mess. Why should I put myself in danger in order to save him from his own stupidity? Which is really not all that different from us saying, well, that part of town. You just shouldn't go into that part of town because it's just dangerous. And you don't mix with the people from that part of town because they're going to be a bad influence on our kids. And you don't go to the park that's in that part of town. And that one, I say that because one of my kids, as we were driving down Providence Road one day, said, hey, can we play in that park as we're going past Douglas Park? And the other kid says, oh, we can't play there. I was like, what? He says, that's where all the shootings happen. I was like, what are you talking about? He said, well, that's what all of my friends' parents at the Catholic school, mind you, said that's where all the shootings in town happen. I was like, well, that's actually not where all the shootings happen in town, and we are not going to write off an entire park based on that. In fact, there was a shooting 2 weeks ago while we were at choir practice at Lourdes, right behind Joe Mawkins. We heard it. I thought somebody had had a heart attack and fallen in the chapel, and I sent my husband over to see if somebody needed help. It was right there. So the problem is that it's easy to write off an entire neighborhood, an entire subdivision, an entire suburb, an entire town, an entire ward, in our case, as beyond hope, and that the people there are not deserving. They're not worth caring about. walking by on the other side of the road. Maybe some of the people who heard Jesus had been the people who passed by on the other side of the road. Because, it's a dangerous road. We all know this. And 10 to 1, he's just faking it anyway. Because that rock outcropping looks like a really great place for bandits to hide. And they probably stationed him down there to look like he was like he was dying so that we'd stop and then they can rob us. No way. I'm not getting into that. If I stop, they'll attack me too. Which is really not all that different from, those homeless people by the highway are all scammers. I've heard that they get picked up in Mercedes and they stay the night at the hotel eating room service off of the money that they get from our hard work. I'm not doing that. I'm not giving anything to them. And okay, so I know some of them really are homeless because there's a camp in the woods. But they got themselves into their own trouble by drugs or bad choices or whatever, and it's not my job to rescue them from their choices. If I give them money, they're probably just going to use it for drugs or booze. There are shelters for those people, and that's all they need. I don't have a responsibility here. Of course, there are some holes in this argument. Some people have made big mistakes, and some of those mistakes are things that make them ineligible to be in a shelter. So yeah, they've made mistakes, some people. Does that mean that they don't deserve the basic necessities of human existence? And of course, if we start thinking that they're all scammers, do we really think that a bunch of people are standing outside in 100-degree heat all day or below freezing sleet thinking they're going to get rich? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Maybe some people who heard Jesus thought, you know what, I get that I have a responsibility to this guy, but I have other responsibilities too, and I have to put those first. I have a family, I have a faith community that's counting on me, and I have to prioritize. I can't do everything. Which sounds an awful lot like, I'm already up to my ears in pro-life work, praying outside Planned Parenthood, calling legislators, lobbying on abortion. I can't work with the homeless. I can't advocate for more equitable funding. I can't try to sway my legislators on these things for equitable funding for inner city schools in order to try to help people out of poverty. I can't work for just immigration laws. Somebody else is going to have to do that because I am already maxed out. Except that we as a church are very focused on abortion. So if all of us are focused on abortion, who's left to do that other work? And finally, I think a faithful Jewish person walking that Jericho road might see that guy and say, is he Jewish? Because if he's not even a citizen of my nation, then he's not my problem at all. And I doubt anybody needs me to connect that to modern life. The thing is, some of these arguments actually have some truth to them. We can't do everything. We do have to prioritize our responsibilities. But the truth in these arguments also has to be balanced by generosity and mercy. To live intentionally as a neighbor means we have to be aware. We have to discern when our qualms are actually from God and when it's time to set aside all of that worldly wisdom and just give without counting the cost, like it says in Matthew chapter 10, without cost you have received, without cost you are to give. The trouble is that life is crazy. I've had a crazy day. Who's had a crazy day? We don't very often have the time. Like I could say we don't take the time, but the reality is we truly don't have the time to discern where the line is between a valid truth and putting worldly wisdom ahead of godly foolishness, as it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, for the wisdom of this world is foolishness in the eyes of God. We are busy. We don't have time to pause and reflect on where things that we believe intersect with the concrete nitty-gritty realities of the daily world and to discern if God is calling us to step outside our comfort zones, to give up one thing that's getting in the way of us doing a handful of other things. So let's take some time to ponder this question, who is my neighbor, and what that might mean. Who is my neighbor? Is it the person who thinks guitars and drums in worship are from the devil? Is it the person who hates chant and thinks we should use organs for firewood? Who is my neighbor? Is it that family member who insists upon sending email blasts to every uncle, aunt, cousin, and every person they ever knew in their childhood, flaming everyone who disagrees with them? Who's my neighbor? Is it the gay man who spent so long hiding his sexual orientation that it's ripped his soul to shreds, and he's taken refuge in alcohol or even drugs to try to numb it? And maybe he's even contemplating suicide, like 20% of people with same-sex orientation compared to 4% in the general hetero population. Who is my neighbor? Is it a Supreme Court justice nominee accused of rape? Is it the woman who accuses him, who I strongly believe is only doing so for political reasons? Who is my neighbor? Is it the last resident of the Oval Office, whose policies I abhor, or the current resident of the Oval Office, whose policies I abhor? Is it the refugee begging to enter the country because things are just that bad where they come from? Or is it the person who's so terrified of the changes that are happening all around them, changes they can't figure out how to fit into their worldview, and this worldview has served them well their whole life until now, but now it doesn't work anymore, and they're so terrified by that that they lash out at anyone that threatens it? Who is my neighbor? Is it the person or even the child who's making the clothes over in China and Vietnam for next to nothing because I'm so committed to paying the same price for a pair of sneakers that I paid 20 years ago? Is it the family in Puerto Rico who's on the front lines of climate change, still living under a tarp a year after Hurricane Maria because so many of us can't tolerate the slightest bit of discomfort? So we set our air conditioning low and we run our cars while we check our phones and we wait for our kids to be done with soccer practice. That person who told lies about me, that person who lied to my face, that person is my neighbor. That person in my life, the one I know, not the political figure, not the celebrity, but somebody I actually interact with, who most represents everything I think is wrong with the world, that person is my neighbor. And now the most important question is, what does it mean if all of these people are my neighbor? How do I talk about them? What assumptions do I make about them? How does it color my actions toward them? How does it color the things I say about them on social media or anywhere else? What does it mean for me to be neighbor to them? Because that's the question that Jesus is posing in the Good Samaritan. It wasn't actually who is my neighbor, like who does this apply to? It was how do I be neighbor? Unless you're superhuman, probably right now you're thinking of a person and coming up with all the reasons why you shouldn't have to be neighbor to them. We're very good at rationalizing what is hard to change. And I think that almost certainly every one of us came here tonight already knowing that the answer to who is my neighbor is everyone. But the real question is the one that we have to answer. What does that mean? What do I do about it now? How do I be a neighbor? And that's a harder question because it requires us to think about the ripple effects of the daily choices that we make and how we interact with the earth and with other people. So let's take that example of Puerto Rico and climate change. It's not my one car left running or my one air conditioner set at 70 that caused the devastation of Hurricane Maria. Nobody's that powerful. But that one decision to accept or not accept a bit of discomfort for the sake of being a better steward of the earth, that decision is one step forward in a habit that ripples outward into other decisions. And all the decisions we make, all those little ripples, intersect with the ripples made by other people around us. And when they all go in the same direction, we can have a tidal wave. So we may or may not have any power to impact big things, national, global policies, but we have the power to look for the bigger picture that's made up of all these tiny little individual thumbnails that is each one of our lives. And that's how we go from who is my neighbor to how can I be neighbor. I wrote a short book of reflections on the Beatitudes, which I have here tonight, what it means to live out the Beatitudes in real life, and kind of with reflections and questions about how that might look. And I'd like to end with one quote from that book tonight. Once we recognize injustice, once we allow ourselves to see the pain of others and make it our own, we're obligated to do something about it.